A Triumph of Surgery. The story, A Triumph of Surgery, is a story of three characters: Mrs. Pumphrey, her dog Tricky, and Dr. Harriet. Mrs. Pumphrey was a very rich lady. She started overfeeding the dog. The dog fell seriously ill. Mrs. Pumphrey consulted a veterinary surgeon, Dr. Harriet. Dr. Harriet treated the dog in a very simple way of treatment and gave him fully freedom. In a week, the dog had completely recovered from its illness. The recovery of the dog was declared a triumph of surgery by Mrs. Pumphrey. When Dr. Harriet saw Tricky, the dog of Mrs. Pumphrey, he was really worried about it. He was shocked to see the first appearance of the dog. Tricky had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage with a leg of each corner. The dog's eyes were bloodshot and rheumy. His tongue came out from his jaws. Seeing the condition of Tricky, Dr. Harriet was very disappointed and shocked. Mrs. Pumphrey informed Dr. Harriet that Tricky didn't eat anything. It would refuse even its favorite dishes. He had bouts of vomiting. Dr. Harriet brought the dog. First, he made up a bed for the dog, Tricky, in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. First 2 days, Dr. Harriet gave the dog only water but no food. In the end of the second day, Tricky started to show some interest in surroundings, and on third day it began to whimper when he heard the dogs in yard. When the doctor opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joey, the greyhound, and his friends. Later that day, Dr. Harriet was present at the time of feeding. After feeding of the dog, Tricky went to the bowls. It smelt them, and licking casually inside one or two of them, because Dr. Harriet did not pick out the bowl for Tricky. The next day, the bowl for Tricky was put out. The doctor was pleased to see that Tricky ran towards the bowl. Dr. Harriet informed about the Tricky's progress. He told her that the dog was recovering from its illness. Hearing the progress of her dog, Mrs. Pumphrey was much pleased, and she started to bring fresh eggs in the morning so that Tricky could recover very fast. And Tricky now had an extra egg in the mornings, and remaining eggs were shared by the partners of the doctor every day. They were very happy when the bottles of wine started to come. They were even shocked when they get brandy also, and they advised the doctor to keep the doctor there, and it would be their permanent guest. But Dr. Harriet informed Mrs. Pumphrey, and she came to collect her dog. Dr. Harriet asked her to wait in her car and went fetch the Tricky. And now Tricky saw its master, and he swooned over her. She was very pleased and called it was a triumph of surgery.